Welcome to AMS on the Air. I'm Dakota Smith.
I'm Jeff Rosenfeld.
And I am Irene Sands. We're here to podcast all things weather, water, and climate.
Climate change is changing our weather. It's changing our risks. It's part of the why. And TV meteorologists tell you the when and the why, and it's part of the why.
Yeah, I think for a long time we were just talking in all capital letters, and we're meteorologists. Keep up if you can, yelling.
Hey there, thanks for coming back and listening to another episode of AMS on the Air. Today we have an awesome interview from 2018. We recorded this interview at the AMS annual meeting in Austin. That theme of that meeting was transforming communication in the weather, water, and climate enterprise, focusing on challenges facing our sciences. So we talked a lot about communication at this meeting, and we've had a few interviews from Austin on this show. This one is about forecasting across different timelines. We had two meteorologists join us for this. First, we had Bernadette Woods Placky, Chief Meteorologist and Climate Matters Program Director at Climate Central, and she was joined by Rick Smith, Warning Coordination Meteorologist at the National Weather Service Forecast Office in Norman, Oklahoma. They both have very different backgrounds. One has more of a climate focus. One is forecasting 365 days of the year, forecasting winter storms, big severe storms since you're in Oklahoma. It was a great conversation. These two are so knowledgeable in our field, and it was so interesting to see them interact and find differences and parallels in their fields when it comes to communication and communicating and forecasting over various timelines. Irene, out of the three of us, you probably have the most experience with forecasting across different timelines. Living and forecasting in Florida, that is... You get a whole bag of things there. You have to forecast for the sea breeze that day, and then sometimes you have to forecast for a hurricane in, say, 7-10 days. What is that dynamic like with your audience, and how do you communicate those different threats?
Yeah, I mean, from a broadcast point of view, I think you set your mind to, okay, let's talk about what's going to affect you first. At least that's how I deal with it. What's going to affect you first? If it's a day, we're recording this in the middle of summer. So today we're dealing with the sea breeze afternoon storms, and then we're also watching 3 tropical waves in the Atlantic. One, we know for sure it's not going to do anything as far as developing, but now we get into like, okay, what's going to happen this weekend? Because it's not only we're watching out for the tropics, but if there's a big event going on in the city, we're forecasting for that too. I mean, our job is to keep people safe, to keep them the best informed so they can make the right decisions so they can be safe. So you have to know your audience. You have to make sure that you emphasize any events that are going on in your city.
Know your audience is something you learn in so many different contexts. You learn it in business school when you're learning how to make good presentations. You're learning that in policy when you're thinking about what you're trying to convey to a politician who you're trying to sway or inform. And of course, you learn it in journalism just in general, or as a writer. It's essential to pretty much everything we do as human beings, and it's interesting how we still need to keep learning and relearning that lesson. So I thought this was a fascinating conversation because obviously Rick and Bernadette take that to heart, and they know what they're doing with that lesson. They've applied it to what they do, but also they're doing it in such different ways, yet they had a lot to sort of resonate about. So that I really like the way you structured that interview, and of course, Dakota, you're the one who set that up, and I thought it was a really good idea to put them together like that.
Okay, so let's get to our interview with Bernadette Woods Placky and Rick Smith. So Rick, I'm going to jump right in it with you. At the National Weather Service, you have to forecast minutes, hours, days. I don't know how much you do kind of seasonally or monthly, but just at the Weather Service, you have to do kind of a wide range of timescales for forecasting. So talk about, I guess, some of the timescales that you've worked with at the Weather Service.
Well, since I work at a local forecast office, so a lot of what we deal with is more on the minutes, hours, days timescale. Our routine forecasts that we issue go out 7 days into the future. Now, certainly the people we serve have questions and interest in things that happen beyond that. So we also use information from the National Weather Service Climate Prediction Center, who goes and does monthly outlooks, seasonal outlooks, all the way out to a year. Of course, those are less detailed, but that's all of that information is used when we're talking to people that want to know, what the weather forecast is. But a lot of what we do is really on the much shorter time scales. Just if we're talking tornado warnings, severe thunderstorm warnings, we're talking in the matter of minutes. For watches, winter storm watches, things like that, on the scale of days. So we're really focused at the forecast office level mainly on the short term.
I imagine it's tough to kind of switch between that mindset. Like during an event, you're looking at hour by hour, maybe even sooner than that. Mm-hmm. What are some of the challenges switching between those two mindsets?
Well, really the way, and the forecast office, the way it works now is we are in some cases updating maybe constantly through the day. The old school National Weather Service framework was the scheduled times where we issued products. We would issue what a lot of people call a package. It was this whole package of weather information. It would come out at 4 in the afternoon, 4 in the morning. Now the forecast is updated as we see fit. So it may be that the rapidly changing weather situation would require forecast updates on the matter of once an hour. Just depends on the what type of event we're dealing with. So we do have meteorologists that are looking at the weather data constantly, weather observations every 5 minutes, whether it's satellite, whether it's radar, surface obs, upper air information, and using all that information to try to produce or have the best forecast that we can out there at all times. And so we don't wait for a magic hour to tell people what we think is going to happen. As things change minute by minute or hour by hour, that those forecasts are updated constantly through the day and night.
Is there different language that you see your forecasters using between those time periods, like more impact-based or more like, I know for some of like the tornado emergencies, there's more language in there?
Yeah, certainly as we get closer to an event and our confidence is hopefully increasing, it typically does as we get closer to an event, whatever it may be, then the language does change. I mean, there's a lot of conditional language when we're talking about a winter storm that may impact the area 7 to 10 days from now, because you just don't know. There's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of things can change, and there's a lot of unknowns at that time. But certainly when we get into the time scale of a severe thunderstorm or a flood or a tornado, then we are able with more certainty to talk about what's happening. If we have actual observations, if we have visual observations of a tornado, for example, we can say a tornado is happening. There's no doubt. Whereas when we're in the watch or the outlook phase, we can just talk about the conditions are favorable for tornadoes to form. So yeah, there's a vocabulary that kind of spans the range of a certainty and possibility as we're looking at the different weather events.
So Bernadette, the daily forecasting, that was your bread and butter for a while at AccuWeather, WJZ in Baltimore. Now you're at Climate Central, where you're working with those meteorologists to talk about climate. I guess what did you learn as an on-air meteorologist, a forecasting meteorologist, that you're using now to help meteorologists communicate climate?
I think the biggest thing with communication, the golden rule on all levels of communication, is knowing your audience, so that you can personalize your message you're trying to get out. And having a background in TV helps me work with the people who are trying to communicate through their television. So I think I already have an understanding of their audience. But this, from what you're talking about, Rick, from the National Weather Service, when you're trying to get a watch or a warning, knowing your audience there versus working through our program, Climate Matters, it's interesting how we have almost like a dual audience, because we're working with the TV meteorologists, but we're ultimately trying to communicate to the public. So our messaging is really driven around to the public, but it has to sort of go by the holder of the TV meteorologist. So if it doesn't fly there, it's not ever going to go out to the public. So it is interesting how we've had to approach certain topics, for example, and really think through that process.
Well, yeah, I mean, and we face the same thing. I mean, we the National Weather Service is possibly talking to everybody from, we work very closely with all the TV meteorologists at all different levels. And so we're communicating with them, and we realize and know that they are the ultimate communicator to the public. I mean, that's how most people get their weather information, is through the broadcast media. So we're talking to them and hoping to help them, give them as much information as possible to help them convey the certainty or the threat of an upcoming weather event. In a way, we're also talking to the public. We're also talking to very sophisticated users, emergency managers, and state agencies and state government, federal government, who are having to make very expensive and high-impact decisions based on the weather forecast. And you have to talk to each one of those groups just a little bit differently. You can't have a one-size-fits-all. And I think that's one of the big challenges for all of us, I think, is just communicating this very complex information, getting it into simple terms, but also communicating at the level that's appropriate for your customer or your partner, whoever that may be. You definitely have to know the audience. That's really critical. And that's one of the challenges that the Weather Service has had. We're a lot of scientists and people with bachelor's and master's and PhDs who are very smart and very intelligent when it comes to science and the science of meteorology. Sometimes it's a challenge for us to communicate down to that level where the average person can understand it.
And there is challenges built into that too that I've learned through my experience with TV. I think my language when I first got into television was very different than by the end of my career in television. I learned through Glenn Schwartz in Philadelphia. He was one of my mentors in the beginning, and we would go through these videos he would record before I got my first television job when I had just left AccuWeather. And I would start to say something, and this terminology in the meteorological world that we are all familiar with, you just start to say it. And he would stop me and say, "Stop. Nobody talks like that. No one uses those words in the public. Where do you hear that?" And he's right. So then start again, and kind of think through that. So that's set with me. And another thing that has stayed with me, he said this, some other people have said this too along the way, is sort of that glazed over factor, like you're talking to your grandmother. And I think there is real strength in being able to tell a simple story that is so grounded in science and your messaging without overcomplicating, but without oversimplifying it too. You still want to have that beef in your messaging to get it out. And that is the challenge for a lot of people.
Yeah, and we hear the term dumbing it down. You never want to dumb it down. I mean, people are smarter than a lot of meteorologists maybe give them credit for. I mean, people understand more than we think they do, but they still don't need to be bombarded with all the terminology. And like you said, talking to your grandmother, I tell our forecasters, what would you tell your wife or your husband or your brother or your mom if you were talking to them on the phone and telling them about this event that was coming? You would not use these terms, and you would just tell them what you think is going to happen, when it's going to happen, and go with that. So, there's a real balancing act there between you don't want to dumb it down too much. It has to be grounded and based in the science all the time. That has to be the foundation of it. But then in our world, we can use some of that terminology with some of our partners. If we're talking to our TV meteorologist partners, they're fellow meteorologists, so we can go all in on the geeky terminology and slang and jargon and things like that. But if we're talking to our emergency management partners, we have to know that some of them get some of that. Some of them are at a very, very basic level. And really knowing the audience, that's one of the most important things, but it's one of the most complicated things to know. Because from the Weather Service perspective, we never know, and TV too, you're talking to everybody. You're talking to everybody out there, and some are going to want more and more and more science and give me more terminology, and some are going to say, whoa, just, is it going to rain or not? That's all I need to know.
It is very true of that balancing act, which you just got into even more than when I started. And it's what I've found is sometimes people, when they don't have the full comprehension, you get stuck in those terms. But the more you practice this, the more experienced you are, the more you've gone through this, you find the ability to break it down to more simple terms. And I think this is sort of making the bridge from daily forecasting into climate, because what I've experienced, I think, even in my shift, after having a career of communications of 15 years underneath me before I made this change, going into a world that's a very attacked science, you almost overthink sometimes the terminology, and you don't necessarily have to. I mean, you have to know what you're talking about. So I'm not trying to get rid of that or lose that in this conversation, but you still can take that concept, you can process it, you can break it down, and it's a challenge. It is not easy to do on a lot of levels, but the more comfortable you get with a topic, I think is where I'm trying to go with this, the more you're going to find yourself doing that. And the message I've been giving to a lot of our broadcasters that we've been working with is don't overthink it. You have found a voice. That's why you're successful in your TV career. So we need to help you find your voice in climate. And you're already starting to understand all these levels. So don't overthink it. Just bring it into what you know in your verbiage that you're comfortable using.
How do you find a balance? You were talking about kind of tinkering the message for different audiences. Is it something you're doing subconsciously, or is that something we're talking to EMs right now, we're going to talk differently, or is that just something that kind of develops as a meteorologist?
I think it varies from person to person, but for the people that have been doing it a while, I think it just happens. I mean, if the phone rings in the office and they say it's the emergency manager from the city of Moore, I know, having that relationship is a critical part of that, and that's a critical part of knowing your audience, having a relationship with these folks in advance. I know at what level I can talk about weather with the emergency manager in Moore versus the emergency manager in another community, or if it's a public call, or if it's a elementary school principal, or if it's if it's somebody that works for the state governor's office. I mean, I think it's important to have those relationships in advance to know. Now, you can't know every person that you're talking to, but for the partners, for the TV partners, and especially those partners that the Weather Service deals with in emergency management, public safety, people that are making decisions for large groups of people, the more we know them in advance on a personal level, going to conferences with them and interacting with them, the better that communication is. Now, everybody in a Weather Service office can't really do that. I mean, usually it's a smaller group of people that has that more closer working relationship, close enough of that, or the pre-existing relationships to be able to do that. But what we're really working on in the Weather Service is to try to get more people into that comfort zone where they can do that. Some people are better at it than others. Some people are just more adept at communicating, and some people it's harder to flip that switch or to know when to flip that switch.
I think the National Weather Service, kudos, has come a long way in that. I think when I was starting, some of the mindset was, this is the terminology, we'll educate people to the terminology. And I've seen a real growth in that of, well, we want to do that, but how else can we help them understand what this terminology means?
Right. Yeah, I think for a long time we were just talking in all capital letters, and we're meteorologists. Keep up if you can, yelling, keep up if you can. But I think as an agency and individual offices, I think I know we're trying to do a much better job at that. It's difficult because we're not, very few of us up until just recently have any training at all in communication. We don't take college courses on some of the things that broadcast meteorologists might, or some of the things that professional communicators do. So, but we're learning, and we're really glad for opportunities to be at conferences like the AMS annual meeting, to be able to interact with people like Bernadette and others who do this as a profession, and we can learn a lot from people that are in different fields from us and how to communicate weather information.
And that's something I think the AMS in general has done very well with too, is really bringing the different sectors together to learn from each other and their strengths, because then that will translate into our communications of what we understand, building the relationships, like you were saying, to know who to go to if you're trying to learn more information, to really have this message that gets out to the public to keep them safe and prepared.
Absolutely. Yeah, and meetings, the AMS annual meeting and other meetings they've really evolved over the years, where you do have, it's so great to see so many social scientists here, or communications experts here that have no idea about anything meteorology-wise, but we need more of that. The interaction and the cross-pollination that happens when we all get together at the meeting and after the meeting and in between, sessions in the hallway. I think that all is just really, it may take a while, but it's going a long way to help the communications of all of us, I think.
To me, one of the biggest challenges with communicating climate, is that with weather, you can say, look, it's raining, check it out, that's weather. With climate, it's not really, you can't really do that. So I guess what are some of the techniques that you all are using to kind of show this full picture of climate? How are you showing that full picture of climate because it's such a challenging kind of landscape?
It is, and I mean, it's incredibly well documented, climate change communications of a distant threat in time, space. Ed Maybach gets into a lot of this, and as many people have quoted that really what became the vision of climate change was a polar bear, wasn't a human being. So there were a lot of things in the early stages that I think were sort of burned in people's minds of this concept. And then, of course, it became political, which just makes everything very difficult. And of all sciences out there, it is probably the most vetted science because how many different types of sciences you have this complete assessment that you do time after time after time again, which from the scientific side is usually fairly conservative because it's being vetted by every country in the world. So you're not pushing the extremes that are within the research level into that assessment. So you've got this very well vetted, very established science that is constantly being attacked, so people are afraid to talk about it, and they're not. And that's what we're trying to do, is get people talking about it. And the whole organization, Climate Central, was started to be sort of this science translation to the public. We know all this. Why aren't people knowing this? So, I mean, I don't have a magic answer to your question, really, but some of the techniques and tools that we try to do are, we've established our whole organization based on scientists and communicators. So I work with some really incredible people that I've learned a tremendous amount from that have come in this at many different ways. I bring one picture, but there are many different pictures within the organization. And we try to, as much as we can, personalize the message. For Climate Matters, our program specifically, when we take on a weekly topic that is a weather climate related topic, we'll try to personalize through data and then messaging through that. So if we're talking about hot days, for example, you can speak globally of, oh, the planet's warming up. However, so what does that mean in Tulsa, Oklahoma? What does that mean in Miami, Florida? So we'll start with the data and the science for our basis. Then we also try to visualize, because working with TV meteorologists, their medium is television. So you have to have something visual. And often we go with graphs, and there are some people that don't think maybe graphs are the best way, but when we're trying to work with the whole community, we're trying to give them the tools that they then go and they can add more to that. So you've got this graph that's the science base of, yes, we're talking about warming. Hey, it's a 90-degree day here in Miami. Do you know we're seeing more of these? It could be that simple, and then you move on. Or if you feel more comfortable, you could build that out into a bigger story. You could give more perspective from Miami's. You could give more pictures of what that looks like in your area. And we design on the shorter scales because a lot of TV meteorologists are crunched for time, but we try to give them the tools to expand upon that where and when they can. So that's one example of how we do things and trying to communicate that. Even in our sea level rise program, we take this global issue and we try to localize it. So you can go into the mapping tool of your zip code or where you go to the beach in the summer, and you can toggle around with different projection levels, and then you see where the water goes. And then we've been able to overlay it with census impact data of how many hospitals are underwater, what population base would be underwater. And so you can really go in and explore that. And we work with a lot of emergency managers and planners on that tool also. So again, that's a slightly different audience. I mean, when you get into the technical side of it and some of the builders, then maybe some of the general public's really vernacular around those subjects. So we do that. So we try this multifold, but one of the biggest things is, even as a scientist, some of the research that comes out, I mean, a peer-reviewed paper is bulky and dense, and I have to read it a couple of times before I fully process it. And there's value in that. I'm not knocking that at all. But if someone's even trained in these matters, and still has to go review it a few times, and that's someone who wants to know the message, then it's not getting through to the general public. So that's why we'll try to take that, highlight some of the big messages from it, and get all the way down to what we'll release in whatever form we're doing. And I'll tell you, I think it's really fun working in my office because we have the scientists and we have the communicators, and every single product we put out, there's always back and forth of, you can't drop that. Well, nobody understands that though. So how far do we push that, and how far can we push that? And that's an ongoing thing in the office, and we all learn from it, but that's part of our weekly challenge in getting information out.
It seems like just throwing numbers at people isn't really productive at the moment. I mean, with some people it can click, and yes, it changes how they think, but it seems like we're to a point where we're just throwing numbers, and it's the same thing over and over again. So I'm curious, what are some of like the storytelling mechanisms that you all use?
One example that we did in the past year really brought in a lot of our different programs in the organization. So, rewind about a year and a half ago now with the flooding in Louisiana and Baton Rouge, that for multiple reasons that people have talked about in this community, did not get the attention it deserved. There was a lot going on with elections. There was a lot going on with Olympics. It didn't get a name to the storm. I mean, we can all look back and everyone has a different reason of why or what could have been done differently. We did an attribution study around that, an extreme event attribution, found that climate change absolutely played a role in that event. And then a year later, we went back and revisited. And we went and met people on the ground whom a year later are just suffering terribly. They have not rebuilt. Now, a lot has come a long way, don't get me wrong, in Baton Rouge, but there are a lot of people left behind. And often in these stories, it is those less fortunate that have a harder time recovering, as we know with absolutely every extreme weather event and these climate-induced events too. It's the same story. So we were able to go and find these people and talk to them, and then release really this multi-package on some of our scientific analysis. So it's grounded in the science, but we were able to bring it to another level, on the personal level of people who are still there and are really having a hard time. And then you especially for people in this community, we know what that means when we know how many more floods there have been in the past year. So then you try to use that to get people into the conversation at least, and sometimes it's successful and sometimes it's not, but of how this is what's happening more frequently and more intensely. It's different for everybody and how they're going to process that, and what we put out in a public project is going to be different than what I put in a presentation to a specific audience. But you try to get into that, to put a face to things of what's going on in any way you really can.
I think that's really important, because the people we talk to, whether you're talking about weather or climate or anything else, people, they base a lot of what they know or what they think they know on their personal experience. So if they've lived in southern Louisiana for 20 years, you hear all the time, well, I've never seen anything like this. Or so I think that's really good to give some perspective, and the simpler way, the simpler the better, to give people perspective, because people's perspective is really controlled by their personal experience or what their parents told them or what their grandparents told them. And I think stepping back in time and zooming out to give people a broader perspective on what's happened over history, that's hard to do in simple terms, but I think it's really important just from the interactions we have. People have a hard time understanding some of these concepts. So the more basic you can make it, the more localized you can make it, the more personal you can make it. I think that has to help.
And faces and stories and as much as you can do with that. Now, again, I say that, whereas our program, we do more with graphs. However, we're working with skilled communicators. That's the whole concept of the Climate Matters program. So John Morales in Miami, he's gonna rock it when he goes and he delivers the message. So I don't need to create every word he should use when he delivers that. He knows his audience in Miami. So we try to give the foundation and the story ideas. That's the other thing we try to get people doing, is thinking about those connections and bringing them together. Because so often people just don't touch them or they don't think through them. But what we're finding with a survey we're doing right now that's in the field, even some of our interviews we've had with some of the journalists, they don't understand that climate change is more than weather. So we've done a lot of work on educating the public on the weather aspect of climate change, but they don't understand it's affecting their health. They don't understand it's affecting their economy. They don't understand the opportunities within it of job creations with solar and wind right now, and the transportation sector, how it's revolutionizing itself.
Kind of a provocative question here. What would you say to a meteorologist, an on-air meteorologist who maybe you approached or someone approached and said, hey, you should really talk about climate more, and they say, no, I'm the weatherman or I'm the weatherwoman. I want to talk about the forecast, the daily forecast. What would you tell them to maybe convince them that climate should be part of their forecast?
Climate change is changing our weather. It's changing our risks. It's part of the why. And TV meteorologists tell you the when and the why, and it's part of the why. There was a time when we would say, well, this is why we had this cold outbreak, because the jet stream really went low. But we had this huge dome and it just got locked in place. But there is more to that at this point that we know scientifically. And when you're trying to prepare your community after floods for how to rebuild, I feel like that's part of the why, is what you want to prepare for and keep them safe. So to me, it is part of the conversation.
Rick, I know the National Weather Service has a phone that the public can call in, and they have an email address, they have a Twitter, they have everything where the public can reach and ask questions. So how do you approach those questions when you get climate questions, which might not be, part of the products that you're issuing, but certainly you're all well-versed in that area? How do you deal with those questions?
Well, I think we have some of the same challenges that the broadcasters have. As there's this, some people are afraid to talk about it, and it's very politically charged. So we're, probably overly cautious in how we convey some of this information. I mean, at our office level, we still do, our foundation is that shorter term forecast. So that's our expertise. We honestly don't get a lot of questions at our level about that, at least at my office. We don't. I mean, we go out and talk to people. They want to know things like, well, it seems like we're having, more hot days than usual. Why is that? Or it seems like Tornado Alley has shifted to the east. We're not getting as many tornadoes here. And is that because of climate change? And we do get questions like that occasionally, but not a lot. And I could say myself and probably other National Weather Service meteorologists I could certainly benefit from some of the materials that you guys have, and to learn more about how to talk about that, because I'll admit I'm probably not very comfortable talking about it, and I'm probably not as up to date on all the facts as I should be if I did get those questions. So I think the National Weather Service and anybody that communicates weather information could benefit from things like Climate Central and Climate Matters produces, because that would help. Because if I'm out and I get a question like that, it's a little awkward and uncomfortable sometimes.
Rick, I know when you were younger, you had some storm anxiety. I share that. I still have storm anxiety. It's not as bad as it used to be, but I used to go in the basement with my dog, and the thunder was the worst part. I'm curious how that maybe influenced you as not only a meteorologist but as a communicator.
Well, it's something that's part of a lot of meteorologists' origin story, is some fear of weather, and for many, it's driven by an experience with a specific event. I lived through a hurricane or a blizzard or a tornado or a flood, and that impacted them at an early age. And we hear lots and lots of stories from meteorologists about that. I think in my case, I was always fascinated with weather from as far back as I can remember. So even when I was terrified of storms and hating the storms, I was fascinated by it. And at night, I was cowering under the covers and trying to block the sound from my ears of the thunder and the wind. But the next morning, I'm at the library trying to find pictures of tornadoes and trying to learn more about it. So I think there was a curiosity there. I think that kind of it helped to drive that. And as a communicator now, I mean, I really have a lot of sympathy for people that experience this. I mean, I work in central Oklahoma, and we, have bad weather occasionally there, and I feel for the people that suffer from this much worse than I ever did, that live there and have to go through this. So I'm not changing the message because of that. I'm not going to not tell people that their bad weather is coming, but I think it makes me much more sensitive to the fact that there are a lot of people that are hanging on every word and hanging on every graphic, and subtle changes in your tone of voice or your language or the words you use. People that suffer from this pick up on all of that. Oh, I noticed you went from 30% to 40%. Does that mean we're more likely to have tornadoes and things like that? So it's certainly something that's in the back of my mind, and we're trying to raise awareness of it throughout the weather community in general, that, it's important for us to communicate and be honest communicators of the science and tell people what we think is going to happen, but also being mindful that there's a large segment of the population out there, not just in Oklahoma, but scattered all across the United States, that this is a traumatic event for them. It doesn't matter if weather happens to them or not. A weather forecast is a traumatic event for them. So I'm mindful of that and try to be sympathetic to that, and try to. It all comes down to just communicating what you think is going to happen, not overselling it, not trying to make it more than it is, not trying to make it sound scarier than it needs to be. If we need to scare people, we'll scare people in the appropriate ways, but we don't need to be doing that every time there's a threat of severe weather.
And it's probably influenced you in ways you don't even know, having gone through that, and when the event pops up, in your approach to it.
Oh, yeah. And I'm like you. I mean, it hasn't gone away. I mean, it's still, our home has been impacted by a tornado and multiple hailstorms since we've lived here. So the anxiety I have now is more, I guess you could call it more dread. You look at a radar and it's like, oh no, here we go again. Or I hope those storms don't come near the house. I mean, it's very detached from being a scientist looking at colored blobs on the radar. When it's you personally, it's a whole different thing. So there's some of that that's still there. But yeah, I mean, it definitely is in the back of my mind, whether I know it or not, all the time when I'm communicating weather information.
Yeah, for me it's lightning, because I feel like it's so unpredictable when you're like near a storm.
Yeah.
I don't know why, but.
Well, it is. It's an area right. We don't know enough about.
I wish more people felt like that, because a lot of people don't realize how dangerous that is, and don't treat it seriously enough.
Yeah. Do you have kind of an origin story, Bernadette, about that's influenced you?
Mine's a different path than most meteorologists. Go figure. I feel like that's my whole story. But it's, I always was fascinated with weather, more than anyone around me. But most of my background, prior to college, was focused on gymnastics. I was a gymnast, and that was my whole life. So by the time I got to college, I had not thought of meteorology as a career path. And I think most of my influences in life weren't those outside the box careers, such as a meteorologist. And so it just never really dawned on me. And again, I'd always been way too fascinated, always staying up way too late with certain storms. We would spend summers at the Jersey Shore. I'd be down there, when everyone's trying to clear the beach, and they had to pull me off. And I remember the blizzard of 93. I was at a gymnastics meet in Florida, even though I lived in Philadelphia. And we got the tornado part of the blizzard. Wow. And my coach is like, you have to go to bed. You're competing in the morning. And so that morning going to the gym, there's just everything wiped out. And we, of course, still had the meet. But trying to get home, we got stranded in New York airport. Somehow they got us to New York, but then there was no way for us to get to New York from Philly. And I mean, there are just so many of these kinds of stories where I was super fascinated by this, but never really processed that as a career, because that's not where my mind was. So when I got to Penn State, my brother was like, what do you mean you don't know what you're going to do? And fortunately, I'd taken enough science as a background in that. And when I spoke with the people at Penn State, that it's not just looking at clouds and storms, it's a lot of science. But I'd had that background, so that had been a strength of mine. So I was able to do it. And once I committed myself to it, I've just loved it more and more every day, really. And it continues to grow through the different steps I've taken in my career paths.
Yeah, I would love to talk to you more about that Florida experience. That's, I've talked to a lot of people that have been in the snow side of that event, but never someone in the storm side. So, well, thank you so much for talking with me.
Thank you.
Thanks. Enjoyed it.
Well, that's our interview with Bernadette Woods Placky and Rick Smith. I hope you enjoyed it. We certainly enjoyed learning from them. And don't forget to subscribe to the AMS on the Air feed in the various social media channels that you can find, all the different podcasting sites that you might be following, and listen in for future episodes as well.
And from Jeff, Dakota, and I, thank you for listening. Happy weather!